I'm Chance Storland, and this is the Spurs Insider, our weekly NBA podcast from ExpressNews.com. And I'm joined now once again by San Antonio Express News sports writer Mike Finger. Mike, the win streak has come to a close at 9. Before we get to that Miami game that stopped the dream, what has it been like for you covering the Spurs during this time? Was it fun? Was it confusing? I got to say, for me, it was a bit both. What did we learn from this experience?
Well, it's kind of what the Spurs have been for a long time. That they've every year that I've been around the Spurs, I've been around the Spurs a long time. They've gone through streaks like this. That this year was kind of a question of whether the Spurs were really going to come together and have a run like this. Not necessarily 9 in a row, but just a period of weeks and maybe a month or two when they really looked like one of the better teams in the league. And I'm not sure that this proves that they are, at the caliber of the Spurs of old, but this was kind of what fans were waiting for, to see if this team could put a stretch together where it could beat the teams that they were supposed to beat. And there were a couple of wins in there against a Milwaukee, against a Golden State, where they did beat the best teams in the league. But to put it in perspective after it's over, I think it's a matter of a young team and a team full of new teammates coming together and finally figuring out how to play with each other. And then there's also the factor of there were a lot of home games in there. There weren't a lot of back-to-backs. And this is kind of the part of the schedule that they were supposed to take advantage of, and they did. And in terms of covering it, it felt a lot like some of the periods that they've gone through in the past, where the team has come together in February, March of seasons, and now we just see what that leads to.
So you mentioned some of the high caliber teams that they beat in the last 10 games. Well, the 10th game, they lost to Miami, a team that I would not describe as high caliber, by 5 points, 110-105. Tell me about that game. Miami went up early in a game that was notable for, other than the reason that we just mentioned, that it killed the streak. It was the final game in San Antonio for a member of the team.
Yeah, Dwayne Wade's on his farewell tour, and it's this new thing in the NBA where some guys, not named Tim Duncan or Manu Ginobili, like the farewell tour and like getting the accolades from the different crowds around the league, and Dwayne seemed to enjoy that. The Spurs paid him homage, but in terms of the streak coming to an end, it was just something that was bound to happen at some point. Miami's not a terrible team. They're not a surefire playoff team, but when Goran Dragic plays, they're a solid team, and in most of the games that he's played this year, he's missed a lot of games, but in most of the games he's played this year, he's been effective, and he's kind of the guy that got them off to a big lead early in the first half and really through the third quarter, and so when you look at it, this, like you said, the Spurs beat the Bucks, they beat the Warriors, they beat some good teams during this streak, and to lose to a team like Miami, which is not a upper caliber team, that might come as a surprise, but it's sort of the law of averages catching up with you. And the Spurs gave it a valiant effort down the stretch. They cut a big lead. I think it was 18 points down to 4 in the final couple minutes, and it looked like they were going to have a chance to pull it out. It just didn't come together. And but when you look at the streak as a whole, I think they did exactly what they were supposed to do over the past few weeks. They, when the streak started, they were in danger of missing the playoffs altogether. Now they have a pretty big lead over the 9th place team, for sure, the Kings. It looks like they're going to be in the playoffs for sure. That 21-year streak is going to continue being in the postseason. And, that now it's all about kind of maneuvering for playoff seeding and making sure they're on the right roll heading into the playoffs, and things seem to be going in the right direction.
Yeah, something you can check out now at expressnews.com/Spurs talks about, well, they were able to beat some high caliber quality teams. Now, when they get to the postseason, they just need to avoid them.
Yeah, I wrote that after the Golden State game. And when we talk about high caliber teams and avoiding them, I'm talking about one team in particular, and that's Golden State. I think the Spurs would feel okay heading into a matchup with just about any other team in the Western Conference. There are obviously some really good teams near the top of the standings there, but the one team that just looks like a horrible matchup for them and is a horrible matchup for everybody is Golden State. When you go back to that game that the Spurs won against the Warriors at the AT&T Center on Monday, it was an impressive victory, no doubt. They handled Curry and Thompson and kind of slowed down Durant enough to win the game. And there were stars playing for Golden State, but the caveat there is DeMarcus Cousins didn't play, Andre Iguodala didn't play. Those are two key members of that team. And when you look at the history of the Spurs and the Warriors in recent times, I mean, they've played 19 times, I think, over the past 3 seasons when you count the playoffs. And the Spurs have not fared well against them when the Warriors are full strength. And that's not really an indictment of the Spurs. It's just a testament to how great the Warriors have been. And so when you figure that the Warriors probably will be the top seed in the Western Conference, that means that you don't want to be number 8. And I realize this isn't exactly breaking news, but the teams right now in that second tier of the Western Conference, especially from about 5 to 8, there's a game separating the Spurs and the Jazz and the Clippers and the Thunder. And so there's going to be a lot of maneuvering over the last 3 weeks of the season to make sure that the Spurs don't finish 8th. And a couple of losses here or there could be enough, because when you look at the schedules, Utah's got a really easy schedule the rest of the way. The Clippers have a lot of home games left. The Thunder are kind of falling apart. But the key here is to avoid the Warriors at all costs. And when you look at the other teams that the Spurs could play, I mean, the Nuggets look like the 2 seed. The Trailblazers and the Rockets are 3 and 4. The Spurs probably will not be favorites against those teams, but they feel like they have a fighting chance against them. So that's something to look for the rest of the way.
Maybe we'll talk a little bit more playoff matchups here a little bit later in today's episode. Let's get to some of the upcoming games. Up next, we have 3 road games, then 2 back home. How crucial would you say the upcoming road trip would be for the rest of the Spurs season?
It's not as crucial as we might have thought it would have been a few weeks ago, because the Spurs have kind of, with that winning streak, have given themselves a little bit of breathing room in terms of making sure they're going to be in the playoffs. And that there was a point when you thought, wow, if they don't pull off an upset against Houston or Boston, or at least do some damage on the road, they might not make it. But so now it's not do or die, but still it's going to be key, like I mentioned, in terms of the seeding. You would not like to let all the momentum that you gathered from this winning streak kind of fall apart by going back to their same old routine on the road. So you would think that you would like to steal a win against either Houston or Boston, and for sure win that game at Charlotte and on this 3-game trip. Again, what the Spurs did during this winning streak did not erase all of the issues that they had earlier in the season. This still is not a great road team. They suffered a lot of really confounding losses away from home. And during the streak, they did win at Atlanta. They did win at Dallas. Those are not playoff teams. Those games were both close. So they have not solved everything that ailed them. And I think another aspect of this road trip is, when you're going into the playoffs, the Spurs would just like to feel like they have a fighting chance to beat good teams on the road. And it would be nice to get a win over a Houston or over a Boston under their belts before they go into the playoffs, because right now, the way they've played, it seems like most games away from home are kind of an automatic for the other team, and that's no way to get into the postseason.
So continuing along here, this is kind of the topic that comes up week in and week out. You know, the words that are going to come up in these episodes: San Antonio Spurs, my name Chance, and then Derek White. So Derek White, you know, the emergence of him this season. Tell me about that. I think I've talked with everybody that's on the podcast about Derek White. Do you think he's the point guard of the Spurs' future? He's got to be somewhere on the team, right? They really need him.
That's the question that has not been addressed a lot this year. It's kind of the thought that in the back of everybody's minds, because the point guard of the Spurs' future going into the season was DeJounte Murray, and he has been out all season after tearing his ACL, and he's back with the team, at least on the bench and going on road trips, and Pop says he likes having him around. But that's going to be the key to the offseason, to the Spurs' future, is how those two guys are going to coexist in this franchise, in this team's backcourt for years to come. And I think the overriding positive theme to this season, and the reason why Derek White's name keeps coming up during these podcasts and in our coverage all year long, is because he has been kind of the revelation of the season. The Spurs knew going into the year that they had two All-Stars in LaMarcus Aldridge and DeMar DeRozan. They knew that they had some role players that could kind of fit in around them, but they did not know what they had in Derek White. And so now that we've seen Derek become a legitimate starting NBA point guard and a guy who can make a difference not only in games but in winning streaks and in complete seasons, I think the Spurs are really encouraged by that. And in a way, it is the bright side of losing a player like DeJounte Murray for an entire season. If Murray hadn't gone down, maybe they don't figure this out about Derek White. And so I realize we're into the final few weeks of a regular season and there's playoffs up ahead. But one thing to think about is how great this backcourt could be. And maybe great is an overstatement, but I think on the defensive end, when you put DeJounte Murray, who was first team all defense last year, alongside Derek White, who's been by far the Spurs' best defender this season on a bad defensive team, admittedly, that's got to be a tantalizing thought for Spurs fans and for Spurs coaches and for Spurs players, that they can have Derek White line up as a shooting guard and DeJounte Murray as a point guard, or even vice versa, and really have a weapon to unleash against the rest of the league. And maybe neither one of them will be all-stars or all NBA players for the rest of their careers, but those are two pretty good players to build around, two young players and two guys they got late in the first round. And it's another testament to the Spurs player development and their scouting and all that kind of stuff. These are two success stories. And if Murray comes back kind of on that same upswing that he was on before he got hurt, and if White can continue this, then maybe Derek White is not the point guard of the Spurs' future. Maybe he's the shooting guard of the Spurs' future, and that could bode well for, like I said, years to come.
Got plenty of time left on today's episode, Mike. Let's have some fun. You're king for a day. You already talked about some playoff matchups, possible playoff matchups. Realistically, who do you want the Spurs taking on in the first round?
I mean, if I'm the Spurs, and I realize Denver's had a great season, but it's got to be the Nuggets. If for no other reason than they are the least playoff tested of that entire group of candidates. I think, like I mentioned earlier, the item one on the agenda is to avoid Golden State. And then the other, I guess, possibilities for the first round matchup would be Houston or Portland. And on the one hand, the Spurs have had a lot of positive playoff history against Mike D'Antoni, the coach of the Rockets. And I think that they'd have a pretty fun time against him again and against the Rockets. But you don't want to see James Harden for 7 games. Portland seems like less likely, just in terms of the math and the breakdown of how the rest of the season is going to go. Again, Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum, those aren't guys you want to see for 7 games. And those guys, like James Harden, have played in a lot of playoff games before, a lot of playoff series. So even though Denver has had a better record than Portland and Houston for most of the season, and probably will finish with a better record, I think the Spurs feel like they can use their experience, their kind of history in these types of matchups in the postseason to their advantage against a team like Denver, who is as deep as just about anybody in the league, but does not have a lot of guys who've been through those playoff tests before. So, yeah, if I'm Greg Popovich, if I'm DeMar DeRozan, if I'm anybody on the Spurs and I'm looking for a team that I might be able to steal one from in the playoffs, I think I'm looking at Denver. And that doesn't mean that they're an automatic win, but I think that's the best possible scenario for the Spurs.
And then maybe a bit of a shot in the dark here, Mike, before we say goodbye. We haven't spoken a lot about Greg Popovich as of late here on the podcast. Obviously, this season in the past, we did. What are your thoughts on him in the future? Obviously, this is a very different season, both personally and professionally for Greg Popovich. He's at the, if you had to label the beginning, middle, and end, he's at the end of his career. Where do you think his future lies, given the NBA and, obviously he's connected to the Olympics at this point?
Well, he's not going to let anybody in and tell anybody what his plans are. But I think the running assumption for a while now is he's gonna stick with the Spurs and stick with what he's doing through the 2020 Olympics, and that is in many ways the culmination of his career. He's a guy who went to the Air Force Academy and served his country and became the greatest NBA coach of his generation, and wanted to coach the Olympic team before this and didn't get the opportunity. And he's finally going to have that opportunity at, past the age of 70 to do that. And I think if anything, we underrate how important that opportunity is for Greg Popovich. I think it's something that he has said he thinks about a lot during the season. He does find himself thinking about players that he's going to be coaching on that team and kind of how those lineups will fit. And he's expressed a lot of gratitude to Jeff Van Gundy for helping with the qualifying team, and I think he's really excited about not only the Olympics in 2020, but the World Cup this summer, where they're going to play in China. And I think he's invigorated by that. And in terms of the Spurs, I'm not going to break any news here, and I don't have any news here, but I think it's natural to think that he would coach at least one more year to kind of get him into the Olympics, because there's not a whole lot of coaching to be done during an NBA regular season to get yourself ready for the 2020 Olympics. I mean, the players you're coaching in the 2020 Olympics are going to be playing in the NBA. So again, I have no inside knowledge here, but I would assume that it would make a lot of sense to give it one more shot. And like I mentioned earlier, there's things to look forward to with the Spurs next year with DeJounte Murray coming back. And so maybe Greg Popovich gives it one more run through the 2019-2020 season, and then heads off to coach the Olympic team in the summer of 2020. And then maybe that's the end, maybe it's not, but it seemed like it would be kind of a fitting way to conclude a Hall of Fame career.
And thank you to San Antonio Express News sports writer Mike Finger for joining me for today's episode of the Spurs Insider, our weekly NBA podcast from ExpressNews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.